question always comes when you are least prepared, when you least expect it. You're just chatting away with, your friend or coworker or neighbor, and they say something like, hey, this Sunday, why don't we go meet at that new restaurant around the corner for brunch? And you just respond and say, oh, I need it to be a little later in the day. Sunday morning, I'm going to be at church. You can't put your mouth in reverse. Ask me how I know. You got to finish it. You got to go there. Church. I'm going to be at church. But it's not like a regular church. It's a cool church. Unitarian Universalism. And then you get the classic question, you know what? Which is a colloquialism for Unitarian Universalism. What is that exactly? And you probably, I know I do, when I'm not expecting it, freeze like a deer in the headlights, right? Part of that is because, look, I don't know that we are a cool church. There are arguments that can be made, but I'm not going to make them. I'm not sure there's any church that's cool, let's be honest. But it's true that we are not like the regular church, right? We're not like Hill Country Bible Church. We're not like the Catholic Church down the road. But then I think even bigger than that is the whole thing of when someone says, what is Unitarian Universalism? Where do you begin? Right? Like what angle do you come in at? Because they probably have a question in their mind, but we don't know what exactly that question is. Maybe they want to know, is this like some new church, or is it an old religion? Yes. Quite possibly what they want to know is, where does your church or your religion stand on certain social issues today? And right now, with conservative churches aligning themselves with Christian nationalism and Project 2025 and stripping away existing human rights, that's a very good question. That's a very fair and important question. Or it could be, since we are a religion, that their question is religious in nature. What's your theology? What is it that you believe? And so we don't really know what their actual question is. So today, let's address those three issues, because I think they're the most common ones that come up, of history, social issues, and belief. So, Unitarian Universalism as an organized religion goes back to the late 1700s, early 1800s. We were two separate religious denominations, and it started in the 1700s. The Universalist Church began organizing themselves, and they were all about the concept of universal salvation. The idea that God's very nature was love. Like, it wasn't just an aspect of God, that was what God was. And as such, God would not allow any person to suffer eternal damnation. And if that was the nature of God, then we humans should model ourselves on that and strive to create a world where we operated out of love and where we all loved one another and acted on that love. Now, from the very beginning, the Universalists were committed to an idea of freedom of belief, bringing in this idea of, if God is love, then God created us as good people, and to be able to decide for ourselves some of the hard things. And this, at that time, was such a revolutionary idea because the United States had been heavily influenced by what is called the Great Awakening. Think Jonathan Edwards, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And this was a message that positioned God with where the dominant aspects were things like power and judgment, and humans were said to be born evil, born completely depraved. Jonathan Edwards said, "In hell, God manifests his beings and perfections only in hatred and wrath, and hatred without love. In fact," according to Edwards, "the damned never were an object of God's electing love in the first place. The saints in glory will know concerning the damned in hell that God never loved them, but that he hates them, and that they will be forever hated of God." And people worshiped that God. And there are people who still do today. And so you can imagine how universalism, with this idea of a God who loved so profoundly that everyone would be dragged, as Mark Morrison Reed, Unitarian Universalist, says, dragged kicking and screaming into heaven, that was how profound the love was. And in that, even from the very beginning, that DNA of universalism was that the faith would continue to grow and expand, because if God was all love, God would not give truth and wisdom only to a small group of people. And by the 1940s, the Universalists then were making efforts to change the whole understanding of the word universalism, to where it was not just about universal salvation, but the idea of there being certain universal truths found in all cultures and all religions. Albert Ziegler, Universalist, in 1946, he was talking about this new symbol that they presented to be the symbol of universalism, which is a cross offset, not in the center of the faith. And he said it's drawn to represent the all-inclusive faith of universalism, which shuts no one out. In that circle is placed the cross, symbolizing the beloved faith out of which our wider insight has grown. We feel that universalism is not the product of any one cultural or religious tradition, but is in fact implicit in all the great faiths. We consider ourselves to be universalists of Christian descent. And some famous universalists include signer of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, Clara Barton, and P.T. Barnum. That's a topic for another day. People are complex, even universalists. The Unitarians were forming themselves into a denomination by 1825, but they had already for several decades been coming together as the liberal Congregationalists, as opposed to the conservative or the Orthodox Congregationalists, and both of those Congregationalists, believe it or not, came from the Puritans. Yes, we are descended from the Puritans. And the Unitarians, so whereas universalism absolutely was referring to universal salvation, and that was the dominant sort of reason to be of their religion, Unitarian is kind of a misnomer. Yes, it does mean non-Trinitarian, and yes, those early Unitarians were non-Trinitarian, but that was more of an effect of what was more core to who they were. See, they were being influenced by the Enlightenment, and they believed in this idea that reason should be brought into everything, including religious beliefs. And so Unitarianism, like I said, was an effect of that, because they looked in the Bible and said, this is not a biblical idea. And in the ways that Trinitarianism is explained, those of you who have grown up Christian, and whenever someone tries to make like a logical thing of, oh, there's three different aspects, no, that's heresy. They said this is not a logical, reasonable idea either. And in 1819, William Ellery Channing, Unitarian at that time was being used as a slur for these free liberal thinkers. And so he effectively did a sermon where he said, fine, we're Unitarians, and here is what that means. And one of the things that he said is, we profess not to know a book which demands a more frequent exercise of reason than the Bible. We feel it's our bounden duty to exercise our reason upon it perpetually, to compare, to infer, to look beyond the letter to the spirit, to seek in the nature of the subject and the aim of the writer his true meaning, and in general to make use of what is known, for explaining what is difficult, and for discovering new truths. So both Universalism and Unitarianism came out of Christianity, but even from the very beginning, they were planting the seeds for both to begin expanding to become the pluralist religion that we are today. And some famous Unitarians include President John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Louisa May Alcott, and there's a ton more. So finally, in 1961, these two separate religious faiths, which had always been very similar and had continued to grow and expand and evolve in very similar ways, finally in 1961, they consolidated. And so in 1961, they effectively created a new religion. So, are we an old religion or are we a new religion? Yes. Now, one of the things that made it easier for these two denominations to merge was that for so long, 200 years really, they had often been, famous Unitarian Universalists, can't forget that. You can see some names there that you might be familiar with, including Greta Gerwig, director of Barbie. These are all people who claimed their being Unitarian Universalist. So the Unitarians and the Universalists for decades had often been working shoulder to shoulder on many of the social issues at the time, because both of them believed in what we would now call the inherent worth and dignity of all people. And as such, if you believe in something like that, then you are called to work for it. And so Unitarians and Universalists were conductors on the Underground Railroad. They were marching and working for black suffrage and women's suffrage. Martin Luther King Jr., when he was putting together the giant march of Selma to Montgomery, he sent a telegram to the Unitarian Universalist Association headquarters, where it turns out they were having a board meeting, and they quickly adjourned the meeting and said, we'll meet back up in Selma. We were there. We were walking with Dr. King. The movement towards marriage equality, Black Lives Matter, fighting climate destruction, fighting for reproductive justice, you will always find Unitarian Universalists there. We are progressively liberal, and the way that that takes form is in many of these what are considered to be progressive issues. Some people think that these are political issues. We know these are religious issues, and so we show up for those. Now, you're talking to your friend, your coworker, your neighbor. At this point, their eyes are starting to kind of glaze over. You're looking through your notes. I am. And they say, yeah, but what do you believe? Right? Has anyone ever gotten that question? What do you believe? Pause. Because our instinct is, because we are different, we are non-creedal. Non-creedal means that there is not a set of beliefs that we all agree to believe in. And we are deliberately pluralist. We draw wisdom from wherever we can find it. Bible, Bhagavad Gita, and Beyonce, But they probably have, when they say, what do you believe? They probably have a specific question in their minds. And if we don't pause, we are liable to jump out of our own assumptions and say something like, in our religion, you can believe whatever you want to believe. Not really. I understand if you are talking to someone in a conservative context who says, if you don't believe this exact thing, if you don't believe in the Godhead, if you don't believe in the Trinity, you are going to hell, then in that context to say you can believe whatever you want to believe, we are extending a freedom to that person. But it's not precise, and I think it comes across as shallow, and it's not really true. Like, if you believe that there is only one right thing to believe about God, the universe, and everything, then that's not consistent with the values of Unitarian Universalism. When they are asking, what do you believe? They may be saying something like, what do you believe about Jesus? What do you believe about the Trinity, the Godhead? What do you believe about reincarnation? What do you believe about God? I mean, it's still a shocking thing to tell people in our church, you don't even have to believe in God. That's always very shocking, and I tell people, I'm like, I'd say at least half of my congregation would describe themselves as atheist. So there's so many different questions they may have in their mind. Pause. And when someone says, talking about Unitarian Universalism, what do you believe? Answer with a question of your own, only 2 words. About what? Don't do it snarky. For those of us with resting snark face, put on your look of loving curiosity. Be curious, not judgmental. About what? Because then they're going to give you some information. And if you are a UU, or if you know of us, I'm willing to bet you can already begin answering that. And then from there, you can get to the bigger issue of, we are non-creedal. I don't actually recommend using that word. I use it all the time, but like no one actually knows what it means. You have to explain it each time. What you can say is, what brings us together is not a system of shared belief, but our covenant. We make promises to each other. We understand that we each are on our own spiritual journeys, affected by our life experiences and what we've read, what we've studied, and our own imaginations. And so we do something really radical. We promise that we are going to support each other in that journey. Our faith is one of continuing evolution. As James Luther Adams, who was probably the most influential theologian of the 20th century, you heard some words from him earlier in the reading, he called it continuous revelation, and it's why we are a living tradition. We are open to the fact that there is constantly new information that becomes available to humanity, new insights, not just for humanity, but also for us. Because we evolve, we grow. For those of you who are, let's say, older than 25, are your beliefs different in some way than they were, say, 30 years ago? Mine are. I continue to grow. James Luther Adams also said this in this piece that we shortened it some of, I call that church free. He said, I call that church free, which responds in responsibility to the Spirit that bloweth where it listeth. The tide of the Spirit finds utterance ever and again through a minority. It invites and engenders liberation from repression and exploitation, whether of nation or economic system, of race or sex or class. It bursts through rigid, cramping inheritance, giving rise to new language, to new forms of cooperation, to new and broader fellowship. I encourage you to think for the rest of the day, off and on, what is your answer to, you know what?